Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the amphibians of the Apostle Islands. Just a little background. The park itself is comprised of 21 islands, most of which were connected to the mainland about 4,500 years ago. There's also a mainland portion. You don't have to read this, but we've been studying amphibians since about 2001. And this is a matrix of the distribution of each species on each island, as well as the mainland unit. We are including Madeline Island in this analysis, just because biogeographically it's part of the group. So what we're going to do now is go through these species and which islands they're found on, and talk a little bit about them. So the first one is the blue-spotted salamander. This is one of a couple salamanders that are dependent upon ephemeral wetlands for breeding. And a good way to survey for them is to look for their eggs, as you can see here. So the distribution of these salamanders is probably limited by breeding habitat in these islands, where they occupy most of them, but the ones they're absent from, that's probably the explanation. So on all these maps, you're going to see red dots, which are vouchered records that we're absolutely sure of, and then observational reports, which may or may not be correct. A similar species is the spotted salamander, breeding in the same habitat, a little better documented, probably because its eggs are much larger and easier to find. You will notice that on all of these slides, there are no species records from Eagle Island or Gull Island, simply because they're too small to support populations. These are mainly bird colonies. The four-toed salamander, the last of these ephemeral pond breeding salamanders. And this one, we started out with almost no data. They're very hard to find, very cryptic, very small. But if you know their particular nesting habitat within moss mounds, and you're there at the right time, you can pick them up. So we were able to document them on most islands, although they do seem to be absent from Devils. Then the remaining salamanders have a little different natural history. The central newt, as you can see, has very limited distribution in the Apostle Islands, only on the 3 islands with large lagoon habitat. And that's what they're occupying, where they're breeding. So outer Stockton and Michigan lagoons definitely have newt populations. They seem to be doing well. It may be interesting to see if the breach of the outer island sand barrier has any impact on them, but I suspect not. The eastern redback salamander is a completely terrestrial salamander. So this one does not require wetlands to breed. They build their nests within rotting logs. And as you can see from the distribution here, they're not that widespread, which is surprising because almost every island contains suitable habitat for them. Madeline Island, it simply just hasn't been herped much, so there's just not much data. But the rest of these islands that are within the park, we've done quite substantial survey effort. And the absence, I believe, is real and unexplainable at this point. I suspect this might be explained by colonization events since the waters of Lake Superior rose and made all these into islands. The common mud puppy. This one is completely aquatic, and it's found in the Big Lake. Fairly well known in the Ashland Bay area by ice fishermen who occasionally hook them. And one once washed up on the shore on Long Island, hence the one dot here. But other than being in the Big Lake, this species is not really a component of the amphibian community on the island's terrestrial and wetland habitats. So now frogs and toads. So we'll go through these as well. The American toad is our first candidate here, and you can see they're very widespread in distribution, partly because they're very adaptive in their breeding requirements. We have found them breeding on splash pools, just from wave action on the rocks. And they have a very short egg stage and fairly brief tadpole stage as well. So on islands like Oak, they apparently are able to persist, just breeding in splash pools. We would like to get some confirmation of their presence on Bear, York, and Sand. Spring peeper, another very common species, but not as nearly as well documented. Almost all of the sites we're monitoring by acoustics are picking them up, but the islands without records, I still consider these equivocal. We're not sure really if they're there or not. The easiest way to pick them up is acoustics. The boreal chorus frog. This one is problematic. It's often in these northern parts of the state erroneously reported on the frog and toad survey, because people who aren't real familiar with chorus frogs often mistake the trill call of the spring peeper for a chorus frog. So these observational records, I don't put a lot of stock in. There's no way to confirm them or not. And the fact that this species has never shown up on our monitoring efforts, I think is more the reality. And chorus frogs are not currently present in the Apostle Islands. Gray tree frog, this one is sparsely distributed. So I'm not sure why that is. It's probably, again, colonization events. And what's interesting about tree frogs is they're notorious hitchhikers. On more than one occasion, I've found one stowed away in my canoe under the gunnels after I reached my destination. So the frogs were hitchhiking from my home to wherever I go. So I suspect that the colonization events on these islands may be explained by that, because there's an awful lot of canoes and people, and these tree frogs stow away in gear. But regardless, they are not widely distributed on the islands, but they definitely are present on some. The Cope's gray tree frog is kind of a cryptic sister species to the gray tree frog, with a different ploidy number and a slightly different call. I don't put much stock in these observational records because there's no way to confirm whether it was correct. However, we did pick up one confirmed Cope's on Basswood Island in the 2017 surveys. It was just a single calling male, and that's the only record we've ever found. So again, I tend towards the stowaway explanation. American bullfrog, this is a more southern species, but it has extended its range up to the southern shore of Lake Superior in places. It is known from the mainland. I don't put a lot of stock in the observational records shown here on the islands or even on the mainland, simply because, like the chorus frog, this species is often erroneously reported on the frog and toad surveys, with people confusing the calls of larger green frogs with bullfrogs. This species, however, is also invasive, and it's been known to colonize wetlands and lakes at the expense of other native frogs, which it notoriously feeds upon. And it's also a notorious cannibal. So it's a very aggressive frog, and it may be coming with a warming climate to the Apostle Islands. The green frog, very familiar frog, fairly sparsely distributed on the islands because it does require more permanent wetlands. and in these northern climates often overwinters as a tadpole. So it needs wetlands that do not freeze. So I think that probably explains its distribution in the islands. There are some observational records we'd very much like confirmation on, however. The northern leopard frog, another species with very few records, at least confirmed ones. And these are all restricted to the mainland and Long Island, which is occasionally connected, and Madeline, which is quite large. So this one is a bit problematic because it's often overlooked on surveys. It has a very quiet call that does not carry very far. So even on acoustic surveys, it can be overlooked. We'd like to get more data on leopard frogs. And the mink frog. This one we had almost no data on when we started, but then did pick them up in these locations where there appear to be established populations. One would think that Outer Island Lagoon would be suitable for them as well, but apparently they have not reached it yet. Wood frog. So the last frog here in this presentation, this is another ephemeral wetland species whose distribution is very similar to the blue-spotted and spotted salamanders, and it is often found in the exact same ponds, breeding in the exact same conditions. This one, again, is relatively easy to find with egg surveys. The eggs persist for weeks. So you have a little longer window to do your surveys. So they've been picked up on almost all the islands, but they do require breeding wetlands. So for like on Bear Island, where there really are no interior wetlands, they do appear to be absent. So then just a little bit about the network program. So the network established an acoustic monitoring program for frogs in 2014, and that's still running. The locations of the recorders are shown in the figure with permanent wetlands in blue and semi-permanent wetlands in green. So by no means are all the islands monitored, but 10 of them are, or 10 sites are monitored every single year. This is what a recorder looks like. You know, we put them out as soon as we can after ice out, or else in the previous fall on a delayed start. In the data analysis, we're able to provide quick graphics on how successful the data collection was, and it's usually quite good, but occasionally a tree falls down. And we provide a phenology analysis with the first calling date for these 3 species at each site. And the number of species we do this for will be expanding. Then we look at a number of metrics to track the health of the ecosystem over time. So the first one being the call index value. And here you're seeing the proportion of samples occupied by each call index value, 1, 2, or 3. So sites that have a call index of 3 means it's a full chorus. Call index of 1, it might be just one lone calling male. So what we're going to be getting at here is whether this proportional representation of call index values is changing over time for each of the sites. We also look at abundance, and this is measured as the proportion of samples that have any detection at all. So as this changes, we will be able to see over time whether the number of detections is changing. And then finally, an occupancy metric. So this is simply graphing year by year which sites were occupied and which were not. The red dots indicate that the sampling effort was insufficient in that year. And these are fewer and fewer now. But we can see here that American toad here is well represented and seems to have dropped out of one of these sites. Gray tree frog, where it is found, it's persisting well, but there's occasional site where it pops up just once. Green frog, fairly consistent, as are wood frogs and spring peepers. These are mink frogs. So you can see these are fairly rare, rarely detected in the program. And they're a species with a quiet call that doesn't carry very far. So it often is a false absence on mink frogs. And then that one Cope's gray tree frog, which we discussed earlier. So to wrap up, there's still some distribution questions that remain. So there is a need to continue some inventory work. The acoustic monitoring program that the network runs will be addressing trends and how that relates to climate change. In particular, we want to see if the bullfrog starts showing up. But it's also, I'd like to emphasize here that more partners are actually needed to get a better regional picture of what's happening with frog trends. So more partners that would be willing to put up these acoustic stations and support the data analysis would really improve our understanding of regional trends, not just within the park. And then any of you doing field work, I encourage you to submit observations, photos, recordings, and the easiest way is just upload them to herpmapper.org. Very easy to do with your smartphone, and it adds to our knowledge base. So if you are going out, just one shameless plug, there's a new field guide to the eggs and larvae of all the amphibians in the Apostle Islands. So keep that in your pocket. If you drop it in the pond, that's okay. It's waterproof. Thank you. And if I have time for questions, I will field some. Thank you to all the people who helped me with funding and boating. The Apostle Island staff are marvelous. Same with the network staff, with the acoustic monitoring program. And I thank all my field assistants. Thank you.